Millionaire humiliates a black waitress in German, but freezes when she responds fluently and exposes everything. They were still laughing when she stepped to their table, her shadow falling across their wine glasses. Then she spoke, fluent, flawless German that cut the air in two. The laughter died instantly. Eyes widened, faces drained of color, and with a steady voice, she laid bare their cruelty, how they had stolen her father's company to fatten their pockets. But they didn't know. This was only the first blow. What came next would bring their world crashing down. Before we continue, do ensure to subscribe to this channel and also let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The Friday night hum inside the Bayview room was a symphony of wealth, polished laughter, hushed negotiations, and the confident clink of crystal glasses meeting over deals worth more than most people's lifetimes. Candles flickered low against the white linen tables, casting soft shadows over menus embossed with gold leaf. From the far wall of glass, San Francisco's skyline glittered like a promise that could be seen but never touched. Camila Rhodes moved through the dining room with practiced grace, her black uniform blending into the dim elegance of the place. She'd worked here long enough to learn how to be invisible. Guests never wondered if she had a story. They assumed she existed only to refill their wine, to clear away the remnants of meals they didn't finish. That invisibility was her armor, but tonight it felt like a weight pressing against her ribs. Her hands were steady, her posture faultless, but the ache in her chest refused to fade. It had started years ago, the day her father's eyes lost their light. She could still see him sitting at the kitchen table in their small Denver home, bills spread in front of him like a losing hand in a card game. He never said the word ruined, but she saw it etched into the deep lines of his face. The man who had once carried her on his shoulders to watch 4th of July fireworks had been broken, not by fate, but by someone's calculated greed. Tonight, the ache deepened. The air in the restaurant smelled faintly of saffron from the paella station near the kitchen and roasted duck served with blood orange glaze. Guests murmured about quarterly earnings and IPOs while sipping wines whose names sounded like foreign cities. Camila tasted none of it. Her world, for the moment, was reduced to moving between tables, offering polite smiles that didn't reach her eyes, filling glasses, and pretending not to hear the casual arrogance that floated in the air. At table 12, a group of Silicon Valley executives debated mergers over seared scallops. At table 9, a couple toasted an anniversary with champagne older than Camila. The rhythm of the night was predictable, almost comforting in its repetition. But in the corner booth by the window, just beyond the pool of warm candlelight, something shifted. Two men sat there, sharply dressed, their cufflinks catching the glow from the glass wall. They weren't regulars, not the kind who asked for the same server or the same table every Friday night. Their presence felt deliberate, as though they had chosen this particular spot for a reason only they knew. Camila noticed them first in passing, their posture straight, their expressions sharp and self-contained. Their conversation was low, but the cadence of their voices carried a certain ease, the kind of confidence that came from knowing they belonged wherever they went. She caught only fragments at first, just enough to sense they weren't talking about families or vacations, but about people, about outcomes. She didn't stop to listen. Not yet. The room still demanded her attention. The couple at table 5 wanted another bottle of Bordeaux. Table 7 needed their plates cleared. She moved on, her tray balanced easily on her hand, her expression composed. But she felt the pull of that corner booth all the same, as if the space around it vibrated differently from the rest of the room. Outside, beyond the glass, the city pulsed with life, ferries gliding across the dark bay, headlights threading their way through the hills, skyscrapers blinking against the night. Somewhere out there, opportunities were being seized, fortunes made. But here, in the warm, golden light of the Bayview room, Camila's world was narrower, defined by what she could carry in her hands and what she could swallow behind her smile. And yet, something in that corner booth was about to change everything. The corner booth seemed almost detached from the rest of the restaurant, as though the golden glow spilling over it belonged to a different world entirely. Set against the towering glass wall, it offered a perfect view of the San Francisco Bay shimmering under the city lights. But Jonathan Kruger and the man seated across from him hardly noticed the view. Their attention was locked on each other, on the quiet transaction of words and power passing between them. The amber light caught on the edges of their wine glasses, half filled with a Bordeaux, so rich it clung to the crystal. They spoke in German, fluid, confident, deliberate. The language curled through the air like smoke, wrapping itself around their laughter, which was smooth and sharp, a sound too calculated to be entirely careless. Camilla had not intended to hear. She was refilling water at the next table, her back angled toward them, her movements deliberate and quiet. But German was not foreign to her ears. It was the language of bedtime stories from her grandmother, of whispered prayers in kitchens smelling of cinnamon. It was part of her blood. And now, it carried words that made her breath catch in her throat. They spoke of power the way other men spoke of vacations. Mergers, acquisitions, companies dismantled and repurposed for profit. It was the language of victory and loss, stripped of morality and weighted with numbers. Their tone carried the thrill of watching competitors collapse, of standing over the rubble with satisfaction. And then she heard his name, Kruger. It landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every nerve in her body. Jonathan Kruger, the man whose signature had taken her father's livelihood and twisted it into nothing. The man who had turned her father's 30 years of work into an asset to be stripped and sold. Camilla's pulse quickened, her fingers tightening on the neck of the water bottle she held. The voices continued, undisturbed by the impact their words were having on the quiet waitress a few feet away. Kruger leaned back slightly, his voice lowering, the edges of his mouth curling in a smile that did not reach his eyes. He told a story about a fool in Denver who had signed away everything in the deal. He didn't say her father's name, but he didn't need to. Camilla could see the scene in her mind as though it were happening again. The stack of papers on the kitchen table, her father's trembling hands, the way his eyes searched the room for something he couldn't find. Her stomach tightened. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold in the warmth of the restaurant. She had not heard this version of the story, the one told from the victor's side, dressed in amusement instead of regret. It was not just a business deal to them, it was sport. They thought they were safe here, swaddled in the privacy of a language few around them understood. But every syllable carved itself into Camilla's memory with precision. Their voices, their inflections, the way they leaned in when the laughter grew quieter, it was all there, branding itself into her mind. The men returned to their wine, sipping slowly, content in their shared history of destruction. Camilla stepped back from the table she'd been tending, her face composed, her tray steady, though inside her chest the air felt thin. She moved to the far side of the dining room, but their voices followed her. Not because they were loud, Kruger's tone was far too controlled for that, but because she could not unhear them now. Each word pressed harder into her thoughts, seeding something deep and unyielding. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly suspect, was that their words, spoken in a language they thought was theirs alone, had found the one person in the room who understood them completely. And she would remember every single one. The bar counter gleamed under the soft amber lights, each glass lined in precise rows, their crystal bodies catching the golden reflections of the room. Camilla stood behind it, pretending to adjust their alignment, her movements methodical and unhurried. To anyone watching, she was the picture of composure. Another nameless server tending to the quiet rituals of fine dining. But inside her chest, her heart was a drumbeat growing louder with every second. The words she had overheard still echoed as if they were being spoken directly into her ear. Jonathan Kruger's voice, smooth and certain, replayed the story of the fool in Denver over and over. Every detail came back sharper, crueler with each pass. She could see the smirk on his face when he spoke of it, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Rage coiled in her belly, but it was a disciplined rage, steady and watchful, waiting for the moment to rise. A couple approached the bar, asking for sparkling water. Camilla turned to them with the same polite nod she had perfected over the years, her tone calm, her smile practiced. They would never know her pulse was racing, that she could feel it in her throat. She poured the water slowly, listening to the fizz as it filled the glass, then returned to her post. Her gaze slipped away from the room and into memory. She saw her father's small office back in Denver, the one he'd built with his own 2 hands when the company was just an idea scribbled on notepads. She could still picture the framed photographs on the wall, him shaking hands with his first investor, her mother smiling with pride at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. A younger Camila perched on his lap, giggling at the novelty of Dad's work chair. And in the corner, the potted fern. It had been there since she was a child, a stubborn burst of green in a room full of paperwork and ledgers. Her father had watered it every Monday without fail, even in the final months when everything else seemed to slip from his grasp. Then came the day the papers arrived. She had been standing in the doorway when he unfolded them at his desk. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of the words. She remembered the way his eyes scanned each page as though he could find some hidden clause to undo it all. But there was nothing. The deal was done. Jonathan Kruger had taken everything. The memory bled into another, the funeral. A small gathering, the pews half empty, as though his life had been only a minor note in a busy world symphony. She had stood there in her black dress, staring at the polished coffin, feeling as if she were the only one who understood that the man inside had been broken long before his heart had stopped beating. And now, 20 feet away, the man who had ended him sat in a warm pool of candlelight, sipping wine and celebrating his cruelty. He was older than she remembered from the grainy business articles she had scoured in those first months after her father's death, but the arrogance was the same. Her fingers tightened around the stem of a glass. The cold, delicate shape pressed into her skin until she could feel the faint sting of pressure. She stared at it, her reflection warped in the curve, and felt the moment crystallize inside her. There would be no silence tonight. The hum of the restaurant was still there, but for Camila, it had thinned to something distant, almost unreal, like the faint hiss of waves behind a closed door. She could feel the weight of her own footsteps as she moved toward the corner booth, each one deliberate, carrying her closer to the men who thought they were untouchable. The candlelight pooled across their table in soft gold, casting long shadows over the Bordeaux glasses and half-eaten plates. Jonathan Kruger sat with his back partially to her, his head slightly tilted toward the man opposite him, mid-sentence in that same smooth, measured German. They were laughing again, though the sound was muted now, a private echo in the warm air. Camila's pace was steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, though every muscle in her body was alert. The dim light from the bay windows caught her eyes, and for the first time all evening, there was nothing guarded or serviceable in them, only steel. She stopped at the edge of their booth, just close enough to cast a shadow over their table. Kruger's companion noticed her first, glancing up with mild annoyance, expecting perhaps a refill or the check. But she didn't hold a tray. She didn't reach for their glasses. Instead, Camila leaned in just enough that her voice would carry to both of them, and when she spoke, the sound was low, clear, and unmistakably fluent German. The effect was instantaneous. The conversation halted mid-breath. Kruger's eyes flicked up to her, his face registering first confusion, then recognition. Not of her, but of the fact that she had understood every word. The faint smirk playing on his lips began to fade. She began with a simple repetition, his own words, delivered exactly as he had spoken them, down to the inflection, the mocking tone, the derision. The fool in Denver, who had signed away everything. Hearing them mirrored back in flawless pronunciation stripped them of their safety. There was no mishearing, no plausible deniability. Then she shifted. Her voice sharpened, the edges precise, each syllable a scalpel. She spoke of dates, specific dates that matched the contracts. She spoke of signatures, the ink that had sealed the theft. She spoke of falsified valuations, inflated numbers slipped into the deal to disguise the gutting of her father's company. Each fact landed like a stone on the polished table, heavy and undeniable. Kruger's companion sat frozen, fork poised halfway to his mouth, the tines glinting in the candlelight. Kruger himself was still, but his jaw had begun to tighten, the movement small and restrained, betraying the effort it took to remain composed. Around them, the ambient hum of the restaurant faltered. A couple at the next table leaned back slightly, their conversation pausing. A waiter in the aisle slowed his steps, eyes flicking toward the corner. No one dared interrupt, but the change in the room was palpable. It was as though an invisible thread had pulled every nearby gaze in their direction, sensing that something rare and dangerous was unfolding. Camila's voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. She wasn't asking for acknowledgement or permission. She was stating truth, and with each precise word, she was dismantling the power Kruger had wrapped himself in. By the time she finished the last detail, the air between them felt charged, the candlelight suddenly too bright, the room too still. Kruger's jaw was set, the smirk gone entirely, replaced by something harder, something less certain. And though she stood in the same restaurant, in the same uniform, Camila was no longer invisible. The rain had been falling since dawn, soft at first, then steadier, washing the city in a muted gray. San Francisco's glass towers blurred at the edges, their reflections rippling in puddles along the sidewalks. Camila stepped out from her apartment building beneath a black umbrella, the sound of raindrops pattering against the fabric a steady, quiet drumbeat. The air was rich with the scent of wet pavement, an earthy, metallic freshness that made her think of new beginnings and the clean slate after a storm. She walked with unhurried steps, her shoes splashing lightly as she turned onto Market Street. Every cafe window she passed glowed with warm light, and in each one, screens flickered with the same images. She didn't need to look closely, she had already seen them. Jonathan Kruger's face stared back from every headline, the grainy freeze frames taken from press conferences and court steps. The stories were all variations of the same refrain: accusations, lawsuits, investigations. Business sections spoke of crumbling portfolios and frozen accounts. Opinion columns questioned the ethics of an industry that had let him thrive for so long. 2 weeks ago, it had been just a corner booth in a restaurant, two men speaking in a language they believed could shield them. Now, those words had found their way into boardrooms, courtrooms, and newsrooms. The whispers born that night had swelled into something that roared loud enough for the whole city to hear. Camila didn't smile as she walked. It wasn't glee she felt, it never had been. There was no victory dance, no thrill of vengeance coursing through her. What she carried instead was something quieter, steadier, a satisfaction measured not by his downfall, but by the restoration of a truth that had been stolen. She stopped at a crosswalk, the red light casting its glow over slick asphalt. Beside her, a man scrolled on his phone, frowning at a headline she could read from where she stood: "Corporate Titan faces criminal probe." He shook his head, muttering to himself, and she wondered if he knew the man in the photo the way she did, not as a fallen icon, but as the architect of another man's ruin. When the light changed, she continued on, her umbrella tilting slightly against a gust of wind. By the time she reached the block where she worked, her thoughts had already shifted inward, toward the quiet sanctuary of her small apartment and the object waiting for her there. That evening, she returned home, shaking the rain from her coat before stepping inside. The space was modest, just a single room, a worn sofa, and a kitchenette, but it was hers, and it was warm. She moved to the narrow table by the window, where a single item lay exactly where she'd left it, her father's watch. It was simple, stainless steel with a slightly scratched face, the leather strap softened by years of wear. He had worn it to meetings, to birthdays, even when he was working late at night. Papers spread across his desk. In the weeks after his death, it had been the only thing of his she could bear to keep close. Camila picked it up now, turning it in her hands. The ticking was faint, almost lost beneath the rain against the glass. She didn't imagine he could hear her, or that he would know what she had done, but holding it, she felt something had been returned to him all the same. Dignity, perhaps, or simply the truth. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the city clean. The elevator door slid open with a muted chime, revealing a corridor bathed in late morning sunlight. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, the kind brewed to impress visitors rather than comfort employees. Camila stepped out, her heels clicking against the marble floor, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the quiet opulence of the high-rise. Ahead, glass double doors framed a view that seemed almost unreal. The city stretched out beneath her, the bay glittering in the distance. Inside, the room was a study in precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows poured sunlight over a long conference table of gleaming walnut, its surface so polished it reflected the skyline. Around it sat half a dozen executives, their tailored suits blending into the warm tones of the space. At the head of the table stood a woman with silver hair swept into a neat chignon. She appeared to be in her 50s, her presence poised but commanding, as if every movement had been measured before it was made. Her eyes found Camila instantly, not with the detached curiosity of a stranger, but with a look that suggested she knew exactly who she was and why she was here. Ms. Rhodes, the woman began, gesturing toward a chair at the near end of the table. Thank you for joining us today. Her voice was calm, almost warm, but carried the weight of someone who rarely repeated herself. Camila sat, her fingers brushing the smooth armrests, her gaze flickering briefly to the view outside before returning to the woman. This firm, the woman continued, has thrived in an industry that, let's be frank, has not always been kind to those without power. We've watched companies rise and fall, some because of mistakes, others because of deliberate exploitation. We believe it's time for that to change. The words hung in the air, deliberate and unhurried. Around the table, the other executives nodded, their faces unreadable but attentive. The woman went on, outlining a vision they called the Ethical Innovations Program. It was, she explained, a new initiative designed to shield entrepreneurs from predatory practices, to ensure that innovation wasn't strangled in its infancy by greed or manipulation. They wanted it to be more than a department. It would be a statement. And they wanted her to lead it. For a moment, Camila wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the sunlight catching her eyes in a way that made her blink. Let it? The idea landed with both the shock of possibility and the weight of responsibility. Her mind flickered between disbelief and something deeper, an ache that had lived in her chest for years. She thought of her father's office in Denver, the photographs, the fern, the watch he wore until the end. She thought of the way his name had been erased from the company he built, as though he had never existed. Accepting this role would mean stepping into a world she had only ever approached from the periphery, serving water to its players and listening to their deals from a safe, silent distance. Now they were offering her a seat at the table, not as an observer, but as the one setting the terms. It also meant carrying her father's name into the heart of the very industry that had destroyed him. She looked at the woman at the head of the table, the sunlight bright on the polished wood between them, and felt the question pressing against her lips. But for now, she stayed silent, letting the weight of the moment settle fully around her. The hallway was awash in the scent of fresh paint, a clean, sharp smell that spoke of change, of something new being made in place of what had been broken. The floors gleamed under the afternoon light spilling in from the wide windows, each polished tile reflecting hints of movement as people gathered, murmuring in anticipation. Camila stood a few feet from the wall where the plaque had been draped in white cloth. Around her, a small group of staff, partners, and allies clustered, their faces bright with pride and curiosity. The soft rustle of clothing, the shuffle of shoes on the floor, the low hum of voices. It all folded into a warm undercurrent that seemed to lift the moment higher. Her gaze flicked to the floor-to-ceiling windows lining the far side of the hallway. Beyond them, the San Francisco skyline glowed gold beneath the late afternoon sun. The bay shimmered in the distance, a moving expanse of light. Somewhere in that vast city, the past still lived, the memories, the losses. But here, in this hallway, something entirely different was taking root. The woman who had first offered her this position stood nearby, smiling at her, then gave a small nod to the man holding the edge of the cloth. With one smooth pull, the cover fell away, the fabric whispering against itself before it landed neatly in his hands. The plaque caught the light. The Rhodes Initiative for Ethical Innovation. The letters were engraved deep, the grooves darkened just enough to make them stand out against the brushed metal. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't move. Then, slowly, almost reverently, she stepped forward. Her fingertips met the cool surface, tracing over each letter as though memorizing it through touch. Rhodes, her father's name, set into a place where it would not be erased, where it would not be hidden behind the machinations of profit and power. It wasn't just a name on a wall, it was a declaration, a reclamation. Behind her, applause began to swell. Not the polite kind reserved for formalities, but genuine, unrestrained appreciation. She could feel it in her back, a ripple of shared acknowledgement that what stood here now mattered. Her mind flickered briefly to the small office in Denver, the framed photos on the wall, the fern in the corner, to the sound of her father's voice as he told her to stand her ground in life, even when it shook beneath her feet, to the day she'd buried him, certain she'd lost more than she could ever regain. And yet here she was, standing in a hallway filled with people who believed in her work, in the mission she now carried forward. She stood taller, not because the ache of loss had vanished, it would never vanish, but because she had built something out of it, something unshakable. The plaque's edges gleamed as her fingers rested there a moment longer, and she realized her voice, once a whisper drowned in the clamor of more powerful rooms, now had a weight of its own. When she spoke, people listened. When she acted, the ripples reached further than she had ever imagined. She stepped back, allowing others to come closer, to read the name and the mission for themselves. The applause faded into warm conversation, the air thick with congratulations and the quiet excitement of beginning. Outside, the skyline continued to glow, the sun dipping lower toward the horizon, gilding the city in light. Inside, Camila felt a stillness settle over her. Not the stillness of silence, but the deep, steady calm of a foundation finally set. Her father's name lived on here, and so did she. If you enjoyed Camila Rhodes' journey, from the quiet corners of the Bayview Room to the unveiling of the Rhodes Initiative for Ethical Innovation, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Share your thoughts on how you feel about her stand against Jonathan Kruger and how it all ended. Rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10 and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear from you.